This bank isn't for people like you." The words cut through the marble lobby so sharply that even the soft music playing overhead seemed to disappear. Conversation stopped. A woman waiting at the customer service desk lowered her coffee cup halfway to her lips. A man in an expensive navy suit paused in the middle of signing a document. For a brief moment, every eye in the building turned toward the same person. Nia Harrison stood near the entrance, rainwater still glistening on the shoulders of her dark coat. She had entered less than 60 seconds earlier. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't demanded special treatment. She had simply walked into the bank and asked to speak with someone about a customer complaint she had received earlier that week. Yet somehow, she now found herself standing in the center of a growing crowd. The security guard beside her shifted uncomfortably. He had been the first to stop her. Now the branch manager had taken over. Richard Whitmore straightened his designer tie and folded his arms across his chest. His polished shoes reflected the bright ceiling lights above. Everything about him projected confidence, authority, control. "Ma'am," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "our clients expect a certain environment when they walk in here." A few employees standing behind the reception counter exchanged quick glances. One looked away. Another forced an awkward smile. Nia remained calm. Her expression never changed. "I only asked to review a complaint," she replied. Her voice was steady and measured. "And I already told you," Richard answered, taking a step closer. "This matter doesn't concern you." The enormous lobby suddenly felt smaller. Outside, gray clouds pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, the air carried the scent of polished stone and fresh coffee from the executive lounge. Nia noticed every detail. The bank logo engraved into the wall. The customer appreciation banner hanging near the entrance. The framed mission statement promising dignity, respect, and opportunity for every community they served. She looked at those words for a second longer than anyone realized. Then she looked back at Richard. "You really believe that?" she asked quietly. Richard laughed once. Not because something was funny. Because he was certain he had already won. "I believe," he said, "that people should know where they belong." The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain outside. Several customers shifted uncomfortably. An elderly woman sitting near the waiting area frowned as she watched. A young teller lowered her eyes. Yet no one spoke. No one intervened. Nia slowly nodded. There was no anger in her face. No embarrassment. No fear. Only disappointment. Deep disappointment. Because standing in that lobby, listening to those words, she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about every person who had walked through those doors hoping to be treated with respect and left feeling invisible instead. She was thinking about the promise this institution had once represented. And she was wondering how much had changed while nobody was paying attention. Then Richard pointed toward the entrance. "I think it's time for you to leave." The room remained frozen. Nia looked around one final time. At the customers. At the employees. At the mission statement on the wall. Then she quietly reached for the handle of the glass door and stepped back into the rain. While inside the branch, nobody realized they had just escorted the owner of the entire bank out of her own building. The rain fell steadily as Nia Harrison crossed the parking lot, each drop tapping softly against the roof of the black SUV waiting at the curb. The driver stepped out immediately and opened the rear door, but Nia paused for a moment before getting inside. Across the street, through the curtain of rain, she could still see the bank branch glowing behind its tall windows. Customers moved through the lobby. Employees returned to their desks. Life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. As if a woman had not just been publicly dismissed for asking a simple question. As if dignity could be measured by appearance. Nia finally entered the vehicle and closed the door behind her. The sound of the rain became distant. Warm air filled the cabin. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The city drifted past. The tinted windows in shades of gray and silver. Office towers stretched into the low clouds. Traffic lights reflected on wet pavement like ribbons of red and gold. Nia leaned back and slowly removed a small notebook from her bag. The cover was worn from years of use. Inside were pages filled with observations collected during the past 6 months. Different branches, different cities, different managers. Some notes were encouraging. Others were troubling. She turned to the newest page and calmly wrote a single sentence. Branch 47. Respect failure confirmed. Then she closed the notebook. Her assistant, seated across from her, watched quietly. Was it worse than expected? He finally asked. Nia looked out the window again. No, she said softly. That is the problem. The answer lingered in the air. Worse than expected would have been surprising. This was not surprising. This was familiar. That realization hurt far more. 20 years earlier, Nia had stood in a neighborhood community center with nothing more than a folding table, a borrowed calculator, and a vision. She remembered helping families open their first savings accounts. She remembered sitting with single parents who worked 2 jobs and still struggled to qualify for basic financial services. She remembered elderly residents who carried cash because they had never felt welcome inside traditional banks. Back then, the mission had been simple. Every person deserved respect before service. Every person deserved to be seen. The bank had grown beyond anything she imagined. Hundreds of locations, thousands of employees, millions of customers. Yet somewhere along the way, success had started replacing purpose. Numbers replaced people. Appearances replaced character. Nia could feel it happening long before the reports reached her desk. That was why she had begun traveling anonymously. No announcements. No executive entourage. No reserved conference rooms. Just a woman walking through her own company as an ordinary customer. The results had revealed more than any quarterly report ever could. The vehicle turned onto the interstate. Ahead, the skyline emerged through the rain. At the center stood a 40-story glass tower carrying the bank's name across the top. Headquarters. Nia stared at it silently. Her assistant's phone suddenly vibrated. He glanced at the screen and looked up. The emergency board meeting is confirmed. Nia nodded once. Good. Several miles away, Richard Whitmore was still standing inside his branch office, feeling unusually pleased with himself. He had no idea that at that exact moment, a meeting was being assembled that would force every leader in the company to confront a question none of them were prepared to answer. Richard Whitmore smiled as he straightened the stack of reports on his desk. Outside his glass office, the branch moved with its usual rhythm. Customers entered and exited through the revolving doors. Tellers processed transactions. Phones rang. Computer screens glowed beneath rows of bright ceiling lights. Everything appeared perfect. That was exactly how Richard liked it. For the past 4 years, Branch 47 had consistently ranked among the highest performing locations in the region. Revenue was strong. Investment accounts were growing. Corporate executives often mentioned the branch as an example of operational excellence. Richard enjoyed hearing that. He enjoyed the respect that came with success even more. He leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the lobby. The incident from earlier barely crossed his mind anymore. As far as he was concerned, he had handled the situation correctly. The woman had arrived looking like an ordinary visitor with no appointment and no credentials. She had questioned procedures. She had challenged authority. In Richard's world, those things had consequences. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called. The door opened, and a young employee stepped inside carrying a tablet. Her name was Emily Parker. She had worked at the branch for less than a year. Smart, organized, quiet. Mr. Whitmore, she said carefully, I wanted to discuss the complaint report from this morning. Richard sighed. What about it? Emily hesitated. The customer involved has submitted 3 requests over the last 2 months and never received a response. Richard barely looked up, then closed the case. Emily blinked, without reviewing it. The customer has less than $5,000 in assets with us, Richard replied. Our time is better spent serving clients who actually contribute to growth. The words landed heavily. Emily lowered her eyes. She had joined the bank because she believed in its mission. The mission statement hanging in the lobby promised equal respect for every customer regardless of background. Yet over the past year, she had noticed a different culture taking root. Certain clients received immediate attention. Others waited. Certain appearances opened doors. Others created suspicion. The change had happened gradually enough that most people stopped noticing it. Richard certainly had. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Rain streaked across the glass. Do you know why this branch succeeds? He asked. Emily remained silent. Because I understand standards, Richard continued. People expect professionalism when they walk through those doors. The moment you lower expectations, everything falls apart. Emily wanted to respond. She wanted to point out that professionalism and respect were not the same thing. But experience had taught her that challenging Richard rarely ended well. She simply nodded and left the office. As the door closed behind her, Richard checked his watch. A leadership luncheon was scheduled later that afternoon. Several regional managers would be attending virtually. He expected praise, possibly even another promotion. His phone suddenly buzzed across the desk. The caller identification displayed a number from corporate headquarters. Richard answered confidently. Richard Whitmore speaking. The voice on the other end was calm, but unusually formal. Mr. Whitmore, this is corporate operations. We need you at headquarters immediately. Richard frowned. Immediately? Yes, sir. Executive board meeting. Attendance is mandatory. Richard straightened. Executive board meetings did not include branch managers. Not unless something extraordinary was happening. May I ask what this is regarding? A brief silence followed. You will be informed upon arrival. The line disconnected. Richard stared at the phone for several seconds. For the first time all day, a small feeling of unease settled into his chest. Far across the city, 40 floors above the streets below, Nia Harrison was already waiting. The elevator climbed steadily toward the 40th floor. Richard Whitmore stood alone inside, watching the glowing numbers change one by one. 28, 29, 30. The polished steel walls reflected his expression back at him. Calm on the surface, uncertain underneath. During the drive from Branch 47, he had replayed the afternoon repeatedly in his mind. Corporate headquarters did not summon branch managers to executive meetings without explanation. Something unusual was happening. The question was whether it would benefit him or threaten him. The elevator doors opened into a private executive corridor lined with dark wood panels and floor-to-ceiling windows. Rain continued to fall outside, turning the city skyline into a watercolor painting of steel and glass. Richard adjusted his jacket and walked forward. Assistants moved quietly between offices. Senior executives stood in small groups, speaking in hushed voices. The atmosphere felt different, tighter, more serious than usual. As he approached the boardroom, he noticed several regional directors already seated inside. Their faces carried the same confusion he felt. Nobody seemed to know why they had been called. At the far end of the room sat Margaret Sterling, chairwoman of the board. Her silver hair framed a face known throughout the financial industry for its composure and discipline. She rarely attended emergency meetings unless something significant was at stake. Richard immediately felt a knot form in his stomach. He took a seat near the middle of the long conference table. The room gradually filled. Conversations faded. Laptops opened. Papers shuffled. Then silence settled over the boardroom. Margaret glanced toward the clock mounted on the wall. 3 o'clock exactly. She folded her hands. Thank you all for coming on short notice, she said. Her voice was calm, but every person in the room immediately paid attention. Today we are not reviewing financial performance. We are not discussing expansion plans. We are not addressing quarterly projections. Richard exchanged a glance with a regional vice president seated nearby. The executive looked equally puzzled. Margaret continued. Today we are discussing culture. Several eyebrows rose around the table. Richard leaned back slightly. Culture. Of all the topics he expected, that was not one of them. A large screen at the front of the room flickered to life. The bank's logo appeared briefly before disappearing. Security footage replaced it. Grainy images from inside a branch lobby filled the display. Richard stared at the screen without concern at first. Then his confidence vanished. The footage came from Branch 47. His branch. The room remained silent as the video played. Customers entering. Employees working. Rain visible beyond the glass entrance. Then a woman stepped through the front doors. Richard felt his pulse quicken. He recognized her instantly. The same woman from earlier. The woman he had personally removed from the branch. Around the room, executives watched carefully. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked away. Every conversation, every gesture, every expression unfolded exactly as it had happened. The security guard approaching. The exchange at the front desk. Richard stepping forward. The comments he thought would disappear into the noise of an ordinary day now echoed through the boardroom's speakers with painful clarity. Richard swallowed hard. The air suddenly felt heavier. Across the room, several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One director lowered his eyes. Another slowly removed his glasses. The footage stopped on a single frame. The woman standing alone beneath the branch mission statement. Respect. Opportunity. Community. The words glowed behind her on the screen. Margaret Sterling looked around the room. Before we continue, she said quietly. "There is someone you need to meet." Then the boardroom doors opened. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The boardroom doors remained open as footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor. Richard Whitmore felt his chest tighten before he even saw who was entering. Then she appeared. The same woman from the branch lobby. The same calm expression. The same quiet dignity. Yet everything around her was different now. Executive assistants immediately stood. Senior officers rose from their seats. Regional directors straightened their posture. One by one, every person in the room acknowledged her presence without being asked. Richard remained frozen. Nia Harrison walked toward the head of the conference table with measured confidence. She was no longer wearing the rain-soaked coat from earlier. A tailored navy jacket rested neatly over her shoulders, but there was nothing flashy about her appearance. No attempt to impress. No display of power. The authority came from something much deeper. She reached her seat and paused. Margaret Sterling stood first. "For those who have never had the privilege of meeting her personally," she said, "this is Nia Harrison, founder, chief executive officer, and majority owner of this institution." The words landed like stones dropping into still water. The room seemed to lose all sound. Richard stared at Nia as if his mind refused to process what he had just heard. Founder, chief executive officer, owner, the woman he had dismissed, the woman he had judged within seconds of seeing her, the woman he had escorted from the building. A cold wave of realization spread through him. Around the table, executives exchanged stunned glances. Some had only met Nia through annual leadership conferences or shareholder events. Others knew her story well. They knew how she had built the company from a single community lending office into one of the most respected financial institutions in the country. They knew the values she had championed from the beginning. Respect, access, opportunity, principles that had guided every decision for 2 decades. Nia finally took her seat. The room followed. Richard's hands felt unusually heavy resting on the table. He wanted to explain himself. He wanted to say there had been a misunderstanding. But even he knew how weak that would sound after the footage they had all just watched. Nia folded her hands calmly. Her eyes moved around the room, not searching for blame, not searching for excuses, simply observing. "This morning," she began, "I visited Branch 47 as part of an anonymous customer experience review." Her voice was quiet enough that everyone leaned forward to listen. "It was not my first visit." Several executives looked surprised. Nia continued, "Over the last 6 months, I have visited 38 branches without identifying myself." A murmur spread around the room. Richard felt his stomach sink even further. 38 branches. 6 months. This had not been an isolated investigation. It had been a deliberate effort. A test. Nia glanced briefly toward the frozen image still displayed on the screen behind her. The image of herself standing beneath the mission statement. "What I discovered concerns me far more than one uncomfortable interaction," she said. "Because the problem is not one branch. The problem is what that branch represents." Silence followed. The kind of silence that forces people to confront truths they would rather avoid. Nia looked directly at Richard for the first time since entering the room. Her expression remained calm. There was no anger in her eyes. Somehow that made the moment even harder to endure. Then she asked a single question. "How many people have walked into our buildings seeking dignity and left feeling invisible?" And not a single person in the room had an answer. Nobody rushed to speak after Nia's question. The boardroom remained wrapped in a silence so complete that the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed unusually loud. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain drifted across the glass in slow silver streams, blurring the skyline into soft shapes and distant lights. Nia sat quietly at the head of the table, allowing the silence to do what words could not. For years, executives had filled rooms with presentations, projections, and strategies. Numbers always arrived quickly. Answers usually followed. But this question was different. There was no spreadsheet for dignity, no chart measuring respect, no quarterly report capable of explaining why a customer felt unseen. Richard Whitmore lowered his gaze toward the polished table surface. For the first time that day, he was not thinking about his career. He was thinking about faces. Small moments he had. Dismissed without a second thought. Elderly customers left waiting while wealthier clients were escorted forward. Young applicants who seemed nervous walking into the branch for the first time. People whose clothes, accents, or circumstances caused assumptions to form before conversations even began. At the time, those decisions felt practical, efficient, professional. Now they felt different. Across the room, several executives appeared equally unsettled. One regional director removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Another stared out at the rain without blinking. The footage from Branch 47 was no longer on the screen, yet somehow it remained visible in every mind present. Nia slowly opened the worn notebook she had carried for months. The pages rustled softly. She turned through handwritten observations collected from branch visits across multiple states. Some entries described extraordinary employees who treated every customer with warmth and patience. Others revealed something less encouraging. She stopped on one page and read aloud. Customer entered branch seeking information about opening a first savings account. Waited 32 minutes. Left without assistance after being redirected 3 times. She turned another page. Veteran attempting to resolve account issue. Told to return another day despite available staff. Another page. Single mother requesting financial literacy resources. Conversation ended before questions were answered. Nia closed the notebook. Nobody doubted the authenticity of what she had seen. These are not policy failures, she said quietly. They are human failures. The words settled heavily over the room. Margaret Sterling nodded almost imperceptibly. She had spent decades in leadership and understood a truth many executives forgot. Culture was not created by mission statements hanging on walls. Culture was revealed through ordinary moments when nobody believed they were being watched. Nia stood and walked slowly toward the windows. Rain continued tracing paths across the glass. The city below seemed smaller from 40 stories above. Thousands of people moved through streets, offices, schools, and neighborhoods. Many trusted this institution with their savings, their dreams, and their futures. Nia rested one hand lightly against the cool window. 20 years ago, she said, I opened our first office because people were tired of being judged before they were heard. Her reflection looked back at her through the rain. I never wanted this company to become another door that closes on someone. The room remained silent. Not because people disagreed, because they finally understood. Richard looked toward Nia and felt something unfamiliar replace his defensiveness. Regret. Genuine regret. Yet even as that feeling settled inside him, he sensed the meeting was far from over. Because Nia had not called everyone together simply to revisit the past. She had gathered them to decide what would happen next. The rain finally began to ease outside, but inside the boardroom the tension remained. Nia Harrison turned away from the window and returned to the head of the table. Her footsteps were soft against the polished floor, yet every person in the room seemed to hear them. The city lights were beginning to glow through the gray afternoon beyond the glass. Somewhere below, millions of ordinary people were finishing work, picking up children from school, paying bills, and planning for tomorrow. The very people this institution was supposed to serve. Nia sat down and opened a slim folder that had been placed beside her seat. There is something else you need to see, she said quietly. Several executives exchanged uneasy looks. The large screen at the front of the room illuminated once again. This time it was not security footage. It was a photograph. An old photograph. The image showed a small storefront from 20 years earlier. The paint was faded. The sign above the door was simple. A younger version of Nia stood outside smiling beside a folding table. Around her were local families, retirees, and small business owners. The room studied the image in silence. This was our first location, Nia said. 800 square feet. 1 employee. No investors. No corporate headquarters. Another image appeared. Then another. Community workshops. Financial literacy classes. Free counseling sessions. Local volunteers helping families understand budgeting and savings. The photographs continued. A visual history of why the company had been created in the first place. Then the screen changed. Charts appeared. Customer satisfaction scores. Employee surveys. Community engagement reports. The trend lines were impossible to ignore. As revenue increased over the years, something else had steadily declined. Trust. Richard stared at the screen. His discomfort deepened with every slide. Nia was not exposing a single mistake. She was revealing a pattern, a culture, a slow drift away from the values that built the company. Most organizations fail suddenly, Nia said. But cultures fail gradually. The room remained silent. People rarely notice it happening. Small assumptions become habits. Habits become standards. Standards become identity. Her words seemed to settle over every executive present. Richard thought back to the countless decisions he had made while believing he was protecting excellence. Now he wondered how often he had confused image with character. Nia closed the folder. "The woman who sat in the waiting area this morning," she said. "The elderly woman who witnessed everything." Several executives looked confused. They had not noticed her during the footage. Nia continued. "She was one of our very first customers." The room went still. 20 years ago, she deposited $40 into her first savings account. She trusted us when nobody else would approve her application. Richard felt his throat tighten. He remembered the woman. He remembered the disappointment in her face. Nia looked around the room. "Do you know what she said to me after I left the branch?" Nobody answered. "She said she missed the bank we used to be." The words landed harder than any accusation. Even Margaret Sterling lowered her eyes for a moment. Because everyone understood the significance. The problem was no longer about a manager, or a branch, or a policy. It was about losing sight of the people who made the institution possible. Nia folded her hands and looked directly at the leadership team. "Today is not about punishment," she said. "It is about truth." Then she paused. "And tomorrow, we begin rebuilding what should never have been lost." Nia Harrison allowed several moments of silence to pass before speaking again. Nobody seemed eager to break it. The atmosphere inside the boardroom had changed completely. Earlier, executives had entered expecting a routine discussion. Now many sat quietly reflecting on choices they had never questioned before. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. Thin streaks of sunlight began pushing through the clouds, casting pale gold reflections across the glass walls and polished table. The city looked different now, clearer somehow. Nia looked around the room and saw something she had hoped for. Not fear, not embarrassment. Reflection. That mattered far more. "When I started this company," she said softly, "I made plenty of mistakes." Several executives glanced up. They had not expected that admission. Nia smiled faintly. "More than I care to count." A few people relaxed slightly. "The difference is that someone gave me the opportunity to learn from them." She folded her hands. "The purpose of leadership is not to prove that we are perfect. The purpose of leadership is to create conditions where people become better." Richard Whitmore lowered his eyes again. He knew those words were directed at everyone in the room, but they felt personal. Because for the first time all afternoon, he realized Nia had never once attacked him. She had never raised her voice. She had never demanded punishment. She had never humiliated him the way he had humiliated her. Instead, she had done something much harder. She had forced him to see himself clearly. Nia turned toward him. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Richard slowly stood. The movement felt heavier than any presentation he had ever given. For a moment, he struggled to find words. "I thought I was protecting standards," he finally said. His voice sounded smaller than usual. "I convinced myself I was helping the branch succeed." He paused. "But I stopped seeing people." The confession hung in the air. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Richard swallowed and continued. "I judged someone before I knew anything about them. And the worst part is that I believed I was right." The honesty surprised even him. Nia nodded gently. "Thank you." That was all she said. No lecture. No condemnation. Just two simple words. Richard slowly sat down again. A strange sense of relief settled over him. Across the room, other executives appeared equally affected. Several were quietly considering their own decisions, their own assumptions, their own blind spots. Margaret Sterling finally spoke. "What happens now?" Nia looked toward the screen displaying the company's mission statement. Respect, opportunity, community. The same values that had once inspired a small neighborhood office to become a national institution. "Now we realign every branch with the reason we exist," she said. "Customer experience reviews will become mandatory for every executive, including me. Leadership teams will spend time in communities they serve. Performance will no longer be measured only by revenue. It will also be measured by trust." Several executives nodded immediately. For the first time all day, energy began returning to the room. Not defensive energy, purposeful energy. Nia stood once more and looked across the leadership team. "A bank can hold money," she said, "but a great institution holds trust." Sunlight brightened the room as the clouds continued to part. And for the first time since the meeting began, people were no longer focused on what had gone wrong. They were focused on what could still be made right. 6 months later, sunlight poured through the glass entrance of a newly renovated community branch on the south side of the city. The building was not the largest in the company. It was not the most profitable. Yet for Nia Harrison, it represented something far more important. It represented a promise kept. Customers moved comfortably through the lobby. A young teller patiently explained savings options to a first-time account holder. An elderly man received assistance without being rushed. A single mother sat with a financial advisor who listened carefully before offering solutions. The atmosphere felt different. Not because of new furniture or updated technology. Because people had remembered why they were there. Nia stood quietly, near the entrance, observing, just as she had done so many times before. Only now, nobody seemed concerned about titles or appearances. They were focused on serving people. Across the lobby hung a new plaque. The words were simple. Everyone deserves dignity before service. Customers passed it throughout the day. Some read it. Others did not. Yet the message lived in the behavior surrounding it. That was what mattered. A familiar voice interrupted Nia's thoughts. I was hoping I would find you here. She turned and saw Richard Whitmore approaching. He looked different than he had 6 months earlier. Less concerned with projecting authority. More comfortable carrying humility. Following extensive leadership training and community outreach work, he had remained with the company. Not because mistakes were ignored. Because growth had been chosen over resentment. Richard stopped beside her. For a moment, they watched the branch together. I met a customer this morning, he said. She reminded me of that first day. Nia smiled faintly. What happened? Richard looked toward the lobby. I listened. The answer made her smile a little wider. No speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just a simple lesson finally understood. Nearby, an elderly woman entered through the front doors carrying a small purse. Nia recognized her immediately. The same customer who had once told her she missed the bank they used to be. The woman looked around the branch and nodded approvingly. Then she spotted Nia. Their eyes met across the lobby. Neither said a word. They did not need to. The woman smiled. Nia smiled back. It was enough. Outside, a warm breeze moved through newly planted trees along the sidewalk. Inside, conversations continued. Accounts were opened. Questions were answered. Futures were planned. Life moved forward. Nia glanced once more at the plaque near the entrance before heading toward the exit. As she stepped into the afternoon sunlight, she paused briefly and looked back through the glass. Not at the building. Not at the logo. At the people. 20 years earlier, that had always been the point. The doors remained open. The lobby remained welcoming. And as Nia walked away, beneath the golden light of the setting sun, the institution she built finally looked a little more like the one she had dreamed of all those years ago.